10,000 years ago, the world stood at the edge of a transformation that would change everything forever. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had wandered beneath endless skies, following herds across horizons that never ended. They knew every star, every season, every secret path through forests older than memory itself could hold. Not just survivors in a harsh world, but masters of movement, carrying everything they owned upon their backs. What if one group decided to stop walking and stay in one place through all the turning seasons? The decision seemed impossible at first, a gamble against every instinct evolution had carved into human bones and blood. Yet somewhere in the fertile Crescent, where two rivers carved green valleys through ancient stone, it happened anyway. The first village was rising from the earth like a dream made solid, built from mud and hope. Why would anyone choose to abandon the freedom of the open plains for walls made of clay? The answer lay buried in fields of wild wheat that grew thick as fur across the hillsides every spring. For the first time in human history, food was growing in one place, abundant and predictable as sunrise. The hunters became gatherers, and the gatherers became planters, pressing seeds into soil with deliberate hands and patient hearts. Each grain of wheat was a small miracle, a promise that next year would come and bring abundance again. They built their first structures low and round, pressed from mud brick dried hard beneath the relentless sun. These were not temporary shelters to be abandoned when the herds moved on, but permanent homes anchored deep in earth. Stone foundations held memories now, the weight of generations pressing down into bedrock older than any human story. Inside those walls, families gathered around fires that never went out, tended through endless nights by careful hands. The smoke rose in columns that could be seen from distant hills, marking human presence like a signature written in air. Children were born who would never know the wandering life, who would grow old within sight of their birthplace. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to be the first generation that stayed, that chose roots over horizons? The village grew slowly, one house at a time, each family adding their structure to the growing cluster of humanity. Pathways formed between dwellings, worn smooth by thousands of footsteps walking the same routes day after day after day. These paths became streets, and streets became the skeleton of something entirely new emerging from the ancient earth. But staying in one place brought challenges that nomadic ancestors had never faced before. In their wandering lives, the fields needed constant tending, weeding, watering, protecting from birds and beasts that came to steal the harvest. Storage became essential now. Great clay jars filled with grain that would feed families through the barren winter months. Fire was no longer just warmth and light, but the heart of pottery kilns that transformed mud into vessels. The first potters shaped clay with hands that remembered the feel of stone tools, learning a new craft entirely. Each vessel was a container for the future, holding seeds and water and the surplus that made staying possible. Surplus changed everything, creating abundance that freed some hands from the endless labor of gathering food each day. Specialists emerged like flowers after rain, people who could focus on crafts because others grew their food for them. The first weavers sat in doorways, fingers flying through threads made from plants their neighbors had cultivated and harvested. Toolmakers chipped obsidian and flint, creating blades sharper than anything the wandering hunters had ever carried before. Trade routes formed like veins across the landscape, connecting village to village in networks of exchange and mutual need. Shells from distant seas appeared in inland settlements, carried by traders who walked for weeks to make the journey. What if the real revolution was not agriculture itself, but the web of human connection it made possible? The village was becoming more than houses, more than fields. It was becoming a living organism of human cooperation. But cooperation required rules, agreements about land and water and the division of harvest among many hungry mouths. The first councils gathered in the largest structures, elders and family heads debating under roofs held up by wooden posts. Decisions made in those meetings rippled outward, shaping lives and futures in ways nomadic bands had never needed to consider. Ownership emerged from the earth like a new plant. The idea that this field, this house, belonged to specific people. Boundaries were marked with stones, invisible lines drawn across land that had once belonged to everyone and no one. Conflict came with ownership, disputes over water rights and field boundaries that sometimes erupted into violence and blood. The first walls were built not just around houses, but around entire villages. Stone barriers against human enemies and uncertainty. Defense became necessary when staying meant you could not simply walk away from danger, as your ancestors always had. Yet within those walls, something beautiful was growing alongside the fear, a sense of shared identity and common purpose. Children played in streets their parents had walked. Grandparents told stories in houses their own grandparents had helped to build. Memory became layered in place like sediment in stone, each generation adding their experiences to the foundation of community. The dead were buried beneath house floors now, ancestors sleeping in the earth below the feet of the living forever. This was unprecedented. This keeping of the dead close, this refusal to leave them behind in the endless journey onward. Can you imagine the comfort of knowing your ancestors rested beneath you, their bones mingling with the clay of home? Religion transformed in the villages. Shrines appeared in central spaces where the whole community could gather for rituals and prayers. The gods were no longer just spirits of hunt and weather, but deities of harvest and home and protection. Priests emerged as specialists in the sacred, tending to divine matters while farmers tended to the fields that fed them. Art flourished in the stability of settled life. Walls were painted with images of animals and humans and mysterious symbols. Figurines were carved from stone and clay, small representations of fertility and abundance carefully shaped and treasured and passed down. Music evolved beyond the simple songs of wandering bands. Instruments were crafted and rhythms grew complex, as the society itself, not just survival anymore, but culture. The flowering of human creativity freed by the surplus that agriculture had created. The first villages were laboratories of human potential, experiments in living that would shape the course of all history. Population grew in ways impossible for nomadic groups, villages swelling to hundreds of people living in close proximity daily. Disease came with density, illnesses that spread from person to person in the crowded quarters of permanent settlements. Everywhere, infant mortality was higher than in nomadic bands. The price paid for the stability and abundance of the settled life. Yet people stayed, generation after generation, choosing the village over the freedom of the open plains. An endless wandering. The choice had been made. Humanity had turned a corner from which there would be no return to the old ways. Within a few thousand years, villages were appearing across the world, from China to Peru to the valleys of Mexico. Each culture invented agriculture independently, discovering the same truth that staying and planting could sustain larger communities than hunting ever could. The patterns were remarkably similar despite the vast distances. Humans everywhere building similar structures and facing similar challenges and innovations. This was not coincidence but convergence, the inevitable result of human nature meeting the right environmental conditions for transformation. The villages grew into towns, and towns would eventually grow into cities that reached toward the sky with ambition. But it all began in those first small clusters of mud brick houses, where families decided to stay and build. The archaeological sites remain today, tells and mounds rising from the landscape like memories made solid in earth and stone. At Catalyuk in Turkey, 9,000 years of human habitation are layered in the ground. 18 levels of village life stacked vertically. Excavators find houses built upon houses, each generation constructing their homes directly atop the ruins of their ancestors' dwellings below. The artifacts speak across millennia, pottery shards and stone tools, and the bones of domesticated animals telling stories of daily life. We can see in those remains the moment humanity crossed the threshold from wandering to dwelling. from temporary to permanent existence. The first villages were not perfect. They brought new problems alongside new possibilities, challenges our species is still learning to navigate. Inequality emerged from surplus, some families accumulating more than others, creating hierarchies that had barely existed in nomadic bands before. Environmental degradation began as fields were overworked and forests were cleared for timber and fuel and space to grow. The villages transformed the landscape around them, reshaping nature to human needs in ways that would only accelerate through time. Yet they also created beauty, community, culture, and the foundation for everything that would follow in human civilization's long unfolding. Writing would emerge from the need to track surplus and trade, symbols scratched in clay becoming the first written words. Mathematics would develop from the necessity of measuring fields and counting harvests, and dividing resources fairly among many people. Law would codify the agreements that had begun as simple village councils, growing into complex systems of justice and governance. Science would eventually arise from the accumulated observations of farmers watching seasons and weather and the behavior of domesticated plants. All of this, every achievement of civilization, traces its roots back to those first villages where humans decided to stay. Today, more than half of humanity lives in cities, megapolises of millions that would be incomprehensible to those first villagers. Yet the fundamental pattern remains unchanged. Humans living together in permanent settlements, cooperating to create something larger than any individual. We still gather in common spaces, still mark boundaries, still struggle with the balance between individual and community needs and wants. The villages taught us how to be neighbors, how to live in close proximity with people who were not our immediate family. They taught us cooperation and conflict, surplus and scarcity, the joys of permanence, and the costs of staying in one place. When you walk through your neighborhood today, you are following paths worn by 10,000 years of human footsteps before you. The houses around you are descendants of those first mud brick structures, refined and elaborated, but serving the same fundamental purpose. The stores and markets echo the first trade networks. The schools and churches reflect the specialists and priests of ancient villages. We are still living the revolution that began when someone pressed the first seed into soil and decided to wait for it. The first villages were not just places. They were choices, collective decisions to bind human fate to specific pieces of earth. Those choices ripple forward through time, shaping every city, every town, every community that exists today across the world. What would you have chosen if you had stood at that threshold? Between the freedom of wandering and the promise of home, the first villagers answered with their lives, building permanence from mud and hope and the radical belief in tomorrow's harvest. Their legacy is written in every street corner and every gathering place, in the very idea that humans belong somewhere specific. We are all children of those first villages, inheritors of the choice to stay, to build, to become rooted in earth and time.